Okay, well, let's formally begin now. The recording is now activated. So I just want to start by saying that on behalf of ENMISA in particular and ISA, we're delighted to be able to have this special memorial panel for Martin. And of course, we all want to start with giving our condolences and our deepest sympathy for Barbara and for the family, for the loss of a husband, a father, and a tremendous friend. I'm going to make just a few opening remarks of my own, and then I'm going to turn it over to Didier and then to Elspeth. We'll speak after I finish. Then we will go to Daniel, Jenny, and we'll come back to Barbara at the end, if that's okay with everyone. And I welcome to those of you who are actually joining us virtually. There are quite a few I can see already who have joined the session. So Martin, or Marty, I was never sure whether he liked more Martin or Marty. I think it varied a lot from one individual to another, but I will call him Martin. Martin truly was a pioneer in this field. So I think we all have to acknowledge the role he played as a pioneer. He was a leader in the field. And for me personally, I consider him a mentor and a close friend. When I think of Martin, the first thing that comes to my mind is the story he told often about tearing his pants trying to get through the barbed wire fence between Hungary and Austria, where he was fleeing the Soviet crackdown in Hungary, coming as a refugee and an immigrant escaping to Western Europe. I think it's safe to say Martin really was a transatlantic figure because he was both clearly a European and an American. So he bridged the transatlantic divide. He would come to the United States. I know he did his PhD at UCLA. Someone later on can talk about what he did there as a graduate student. But he would go on to be an incredibly active scholar. And I think if you look at this lineup that we have here, panelists today, it is pretty predominantly a European group, although I guess Elspeth, I think, is originally Canadian, and I, of course, am an American. But we really are sort of bridging the divide between Europe and the United States. And I know Barbara, in particular, spent much of her career trying to build bridges between the two scholarly communities. Martin, I think, will be forever remembered as the founder of ENMISA. In this sense, he really was ahead of his time, bringing together ethnicity, nationalism, migration, starting this section back in the 90s. I think ENMISA, I haven't looked at the exact count, but ENMISA is certainly one of the biggest and most followed sections at ISA. So we are deeply and grateful to Martin for having done this. I know we struggled for many years to get APSA to agree to create a section on migration. So Martin was way ahead of the curve. Of course, the sociologists, historians, and others had already started looking at migration long before that. So in this sense, Martin was a pioneer and a leader. I also mentioned that he was a mentor to me in particular. I got to know Martin right from the beginning of my career. I can't remember, maybe Barbara can jog my memory if I met him through Barbara or separately. My first real vivid memory of interacting with Martin came on my very first APSA panel, which was in Washington, D.C. in 1984. I remember the panel was about, it was really about the administrative state, comparative administrative politics. Martin was the chair of the panel. The others I remember on the panel were Ezra Suleiman. Some of you may remember Ezra quite well, and B. Guy Peters, who I think was a very close friend and collaborator of Martin's. So at that point, we were really talking a lot about the state and state autonomy. I was in something of a Gramscian mode at that point in my career, trying to figure out how to bring the state into understanding social phenomena and migration in particular. Now I'm reminded that people like me who are still preoccupied with the state, we're pretty old-fashioned and conservative, I guess. Now the desire, I see Barbara smiling, is to try to get the state back out of the picture and to deconstruct the state and borders. So I guess we should go back to a more Foucauldian approach to these things. I'm also grateful to Barbara for Barbara is the one who actually first put a label on my work, my early work. She wrote a review about a book that I did on immigrants, markets, and states, and she called it the liberal state hypothesis. I'm sitting here looking at the first thing that I did collaboratively with Martin and Barbara, which was the 1986 issue of the Annals. Barbara, I'm sure will remember this issue. I was lucky for a young scholar to be part of such an all-star lineup. And if you look at the articles in this, many of them today are classics. I just going to quickly glance through the contributors. In addition to Barbara and Martin, you had Mike Piori, Rosemarie Rogers, Gary Freeman, Mark Miller, Sabri Sayari, Bill Safran, and Guy Peters, Bob Bach. Some of those articles went on to become really classics in the field, including, I might add, the one that I contributed, which gave rise to the famous gap hypothesis. I always thought that was sort of a silly idea, but it was something that really caught on. So I remember so many of those exchanges and discussions with Mike Piori, Martin, Barbara, Gary Freeman, Mark Miller, Bob Bach, and others. So so over the years, I was in many meetings with Martin. Another one that I remember very fondly, and I'm sure Barbara will remember this as well, was our meetings in Germany over the years. Our European friends in particular. We just lost Zig Layton Henry, who was a leader in this field as well. I know Barbara and Martin were very, very close to Zig. And our close mutual friend, Barbara Dietrich Trenhardt, with whom I am still working very, very closely. You may remember meetings in Warwick, we had this famous Magnet Societies project in the late 90s and 2000s, funded by the German American Academic Council. And Barbara, do you remember those nice walks in the woods around Hanover and Lochem at the Evangelische Academy? So what memories come back? I can still see you and Martin walking with us in that group, and Gary Freeman carrying his jacket on his shoulder. So I have grown, over the times, very close to Barbara and to Martin. Barbara, as I mentioned, really has devoted so much of her career to bridging this divide between European and American social science. Barbara, I don't know if it's still a dialogue of the deaf. You will have to tell me if we've made great progress, but you and Martin were so instrumental in this. So I think we can say that Martin is and Barbara, they're sort of the quintessential power couple in academia. And I want to thank, especially before I stop, I want to thank Daniel, who worked so hard to make this happen, along with Lembetike, who's somewhere there in the background, and of course Didier Bigo and Elspeth H, who we're going to speak next, and we're so delighted that Jenny Woostenberg managed to defeat the technical problems, and she is with us. Jenny, of course, was a student of Martin Heisler's at the University of Maryland. So Didier, I would like to pass je te donne la parole. So I'm going to pass the baton now to Didier and to Elspeth. So let's hear from you.
Well, as all the people here, I really want to bring my best thoughts to Barbara. And we were so shocked of this terrible events. And I really I try to remember also when we met with Martin and to do this kind of remembrance. And I remember it was during the 90s. And I was invited at a colloquium by Tedger. And he was a big figure, but I have forgotten almost everything he said. But I encountered on the same meeting Martin and Hayward Alker. And with both, we began a very long conversation. And I came regularly to the ISA to see Martin. He was for me really, at each ISA we met, and it was each time such a great pleasure to engage with him. And he was so kind to accept to listen to my broken English, and of course his fluency in French, as well as the knowledge of contemporary academic life in France, but Belgium, but Denmark, but Hungary, but all the different European countries, was so important. And it was also a way for me to consider that I was welcome in this universe of Anglo-American political science, when he opens for me so many doors, introducing me to key American political scientists and sociologists. And I have to say that it was not always the ones already famous in Europe, but the most in-depth thinkers. And his book recommendations were crucial for my own trajectory. Each time we discussed, he gave me people that I've never heard of, and each time they were absolutely crucial for the understanding of certain phenomena. And of course, Barbara has done that too. And it was such, a rich encounter. Among the most important for me. And that's what has created also a strong friendship with him. And I consider that, yes, he was also one of my tutors in terms of thinking and organizing my research. And we began to have collective projects together by the late 19th around the question of border control, freedom of movement, but also about the way to analyze security outside of the frame of IR of that time. And we discussed about securitization and insecuritization, about the role of violence in history, about social transformation and transnational form of conflict. We were convinced that, of course, the discussion on migration, ethnicity were a very important subject, and that they were crucial. And the debates were sometimes intense, but also, and that's why we decided with that ENMISA was strong enough to generate interesting debates, but it was also necessary to create a new section discussing the relation between international relations, political sociology, and political science. That too many assumptions were continuing to invisibilize the profound interrogation and turn into recommendation for policy making instead of discussing the argument of different intellectual traditions. And that's really what, for me, Martin has done, is that not only he was a great specialist of the current element, but it was the way he always put in context and theorized what was going on, and not only giving some update. And that's when we met in Los Angeles, and I invited Martin Heisler to come to Paris to reinforce the links that we proposed to create a section called International Political Sociology, which was accepted in February 2001 in Chicago, and we have, I could, of course, it was so important that Martin create this section, and that we had also a kind of transformation of the way in which it was possible to analyze security and the form of liberal violence and inequalities. We had five panels for the first year, and we were very happy to have 5 at that time. And now, well, it looks very small, but they were about liberalism, in security and inequality, structure and process of societal and global inequality and exclusion. And I think that, well, 20 years after, we are afraid sometimes that these kind of questions are almost forgotten. One of the key moments for us was, of course, the colloquium which was in Paris on the 11th September 2001. So we were all together that very day, where the title was, "Does the State Still Manage Security?" And of course, it was something with a lot of people there. And we had Melvin Frost, Jeffrey Smans, Vivienne Jabry, Jean-Paul Anon, Alex MacLeod, George Thomas, Joseph Lapid, Elspeth, and many others. And it was a strong moment also of interrogation. And we continue to discuss and to create the possibility for new way of thinking. And I will not speak too long, just what has been maybe the most important moment for us was after when we went to Portland, where I had the email of Martin saying, we have bought a nice but quite expensive house. Unfortunately, we need to hire this house for 2 years. And I know that it was a very important moment. And I have some of the photo about that. And intellectually, it was also the roundtable of where Martin participated in 2008. It was for me a key moment for the orientation of the section, because Martin insisted on the dimension of the social and of the understanding of the notion of society that emerged from a sociological approach, distinct from political science and its vision in terms of individual behavioral pattern, norms, and ideas. And this idea of the social, which is always embedded along the longue durée, the trajectory, structural, and at the same moment, very intimate history of families were absolutely crucial for the section. I think they will continue long, and of course, Elspeth will now develop more about this point of view of Martin concerning the semi-settled migration and all what he has done on migration.
Thank you very much, James, and everyone else, for putting together this tribute. And I'm very honored to have been invited to participate. For me, this is a magnificent opportunity to credit someone who's been terribly important in my own intellectual development. Of course, I met Martin and Barbara through Didier. And what I want to say at the moment, for the moment, is really what an impressive intellectual couple Martin and Barbara have been. What an important influence on me they have been together, because of course they are much more, they have been much more than the sum of the parts. This is an exponential relationship of incredibly interesting intellectual thought and research. And I think there are two pieces of research which I think exemplify the relationship of, for me, of Martin and Barbara in the intellectual world, and which have been very important for me. The first is Martin's longitudinal work on 5 families and their integration in France over 20 years. Every few years he would come back and re-interview them and ask them how they were all getting on and what they were doing. And I remember one time when he was in Paris, we all had dinner together, and he said, I asked him, well, what do they say? You know, these people have now been resident in France for 30 years. What do they say about integration? Have they integrated? And he said to me, well, the monsieur said, actually, we have integrated as far as the French will allow us. And I use that in teaching all the time about this whole idea about migration and integration and what is the relationship. Very much inspired by Barbara's work, particularly Barbara's work on the prisoners of war, the German prisoners of war in America who go back to America after the end of the war, and the outcomes and their lives. And here again, this idea that Barbara developed with Martin through the interviews with individuals about their lives has been extremely important to me. And I use it with my PhD students, where I say, if you want to know what really happened, you have to talk to the people and you have to find out their perspective of their importance. And I'll just finish as a bit of a tribute to Martin and Barbara. About a year after I had met them for the first time, and I thought this was just the most amazing couple I'd ever met, I ran into Dimitri Papadimitriou somewhere. And I said, Dimitri, I've met these incredible people. They're just so amazing. And he had this huge smile on his face. He said, yes, I introduced them to one another. So thank you so much for the opportunity to say some kind words about 2 people who've been so important to me.
Well, if I could just interject here, we're right on time, in spite of the fact that we started just a bit late. So we should have a lot of time for discussion and participation, and we want to give Barbara lots of time at the end of the panel to respond. But now we're going to move to Daniel, I think, and then to Jenny. So Daniel, it's your turn.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So it's of course really hard to step to the podium after these incredible remarks of people who have known Martin much longer than I did. So let me just add a few things from my perspective as somebody who's come in much later and has known him for only, I think, about 10, 12 years or so. And let me start actually with a quote that I took from his website, which I think sets the stage. He says, I'm quoting, "Some of the salient, indeed seminal problems in social and political life, knowing that while their solution will elude me, I will never lack intellectual stimulation, will learn much in the process and usually enjoy their quest," unquote. So I think this idea that he really wanted to understand intellectually and in deeply, and which has informed a lot of the work he did in international political sociology, in comparative historical political studies, studying the politics and international relations of Europe, but also really his comparative historical work on ethnicity and ethnic identity, ethnic relations, and of course, as Didier and Elspeth and Jim mentioned, migration and security. And in the course of the work that he did, he used very different tools and methodologies, including quantitative analysis and qualitative research, using interpretive methods and ethnographic research. For example, in the preparation of today's panel, I looked at some of the stuff that I read of his and cite of his, and I looked again at the recent piece he wrote in a joint in an edited book by Elspeth and her colleague Dukba Basaran, which was called Then and Now, Here and There, Personal Academic Perspectives on Migration. And there he frames a lot of the ideas that are current in the discussions on the drivers and determinants of migration. He looks at the temporal, the spatial, the societal context of migration, looking at factors that are political and normative circumstances at the macro level, but at the micro level, the social, economic, the cultural, political capital that migrants have. And again, that resonates with all the big discussions we're having right now on what prompts migration, what is the difference and the relationship between the structural and the agency of migrants. And in this article, then he really goes into his own personal history, and some of the stuff was mentioned by Jim about how he weaves his immigrant identity that has shaped him since he was 11 years old, became a refugee, and his empathy with becoming a migrant later on, being in Denmark and elsewhere, and how the personal and his academic have coincided in many regards. I also looked again at his 1993 article on migration and the links between social and societal security. And Didier Bigo, of course, one of the big gurus of security studies, was also at the forefront of pushing this. And so Heisler and Didier, and of course the Myron Wiener school that Jim was involved in, was framing migration securitization much before the mainstream did. And my first own publication on securitization migration in 2015, 6 years ago is from here. It seems to me an age ago, but that's of course nothing in the history of these concepts. Let me just conclude with a few ideas on his work as an institution builder. Many of you know probably that his first doctoral student that he encouraged to work on migration was Dimitris Papandreou, and Elspeth mentioned him as matchmaker, which I didn't know before either. But as most people on this panel and in the audience know, that Dimitros became the founder and president of the Migration Policy Institute, one of the key institutions today working on policy in the section of policy and migration research. And when I became chair of ENMISA 2 years ago, Marty told me how much convincing needed to be done in the beginning, like how hard it was to actually start ENMISA, and now reaping the fruits of this this endeavor. And I know it's never just one person, it's always a conglomerate of people, a community of people. Jim mentioned the migration group at APSA, and I think Willem Maas is in the audience today, who was one of the key people pushing for this migration citizen group at APSA. So it's always a group of people, but it needs some people who really take the baton and run with it, and he did that. He was one of the people whose brainchild ENMISA was, and now we have close to 500 people who every year engage in really important discussions. Actually, for the 50th anniversary of ISA 3 years ago, I really wanted to write a historical piece on ENMISA with Marty, but many of these plans never materialized. And Catherine Götze, who is in the chat, but she is in Tasmania and can't unmute herself, which I would have hoped she would do later, but she says the entire house is sleeping, reminded us, and Didier said this too, he also was a co-founder of the IPS section, one of the largest sections now at ISA, so it's beyond ENMISA, which I identify him with, that he was really influential. And my first official role within ENMISA several years ago was actually as a member of the Martin Heisler Graduate Student Award panel or committee. So as you know, each year our section gives an award for the best graduate student paper. So I think it's very fitting because his research really continues to inspire young researchers, right? And it still carries the seed for future lines of research with a global, comparative, interdisciplinary, historical, and engaged scholarship perspective. Of course, I remember much great advice every time I came to either ISA or APSA. I had many laughs with Marty. I learned that there is a reason Northern Europeans don't talk with their hands. Unfortunately, I unlearned that, and it may result in spilling a beer over somebody's pants. And that person may or may not have been Marty, and the other person may or may not have been me. I don't admit to anything, but if it had been me and it had been Marty, he would have been very nice about it and declined my offer to pay for his dry cleaning. So just know that he will be truly missed, and I miss him personally as a scholar too. But I know that his intellectual heritage and thought will continue to shape research on ethnicity, on nationalism and migration in the few days to come. Thanks everybody for coming and for sharing your thoughts on Marty and his legacy.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much. We're now going to actually segue to someone who was a student of Martin's and who is joining us from Britain. It's somewhat late in the afternoon, but let's turn the podium over now to Jenny Woostenberg. Jenny?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so glad that I'm able to take part in the panel today, and thanks for organizing it. So Martin was the chair of my dissertation committee in the Department of Government Politics at the University of Maryland, what is called in Germany a Doktorvater, which I always, in the abstract thought was sort of silly and antiquated, but I don't know, for Martin, it kind of worked. So he and Daniel was just saying that he's one of the ones who hasn't known him quite as long. And I thought, I'm in that category too, but I've actually known him almost 20 years as well now, which seems a very long time. So Martin, even though he became a professor emeritus in 2006, and I didn't graduate with my PhD until 2010, he stayed a very close advisor for me with very long, detailed advisory emails, and has stayed a close advisor and untiring writer of recommendation letters since then. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. I know there are some other people in the audience who probably feel the same way. So I want to talk a little bit about Martin as a mentor, and I'll try not to take up too much time as well. I think I was aware that Martin was going to be an important person for me in the department before I even joined, because Jim was advising me on graduate programs. And I took a seminar with Martin, I think it must have been in 2004, on the comparative politics of Europe. So that's really where I started to get guidance from Martin and started developing my dissertation topic on civil society activism in German memory politics. And I think that I'm just sort of piecing things together. I think that this must have been also the time when Martin really started working directly on the politics of history and memory, though of course he no doubt was thinking about it for much longer. But this, I think the most prominent outcome of this work was here I have it right here, the special issue that Martin edited in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, which like the other one that Jim mentioned, has really some of the most important scholars on memory politics in the field. And so, if I could try to sort of boil down Martin's character as a mentor, I would say three things. One is that he clearly immersed himself in a very close-knit community, which is obviously absolutely obvious here. And he was part of this community through which he developed ideas. And he mentioned this also in the piece that he wrote in Light from the Ashes. But this was also really clear in the way that he spoke to us students about, the way in which scholarship works when you're still sort of trying to figure it out at the beginning. So every conversation that I had with him about the scholarship that was important that I should look into was very appreciative, even of the people he disagreed with. And I think that he also modeled this scholarship as a community to me. At my very first EPSA was also with Martin on a panel that he organized. And he helped me sort of come into this community and involve me in projects and introduce me to people at conferences and so forth. So that was really important. The second thing, this really struck me the other day when I pulled out my Martin papers folder to look at them again, that just reading them again, I immediately felt like I was talking to him. And so I think that there wasn't really a division between him as a person and as a scholar. And all his writing and every conversation I remember with him was always so full of complexity, right? Every statement sort of has a caveat or a sidebar or something else that needs to be mentioned in order to not make things too simplistic. And so I think I came out of every meeting I had with him, out of his office, not necessarily knowing exactly where I needed to go, but with lots, like you also said, with lots of recommendations for reading, lots of concepts I needed to look into. And he was truly a comparativist, right? Because even though I was focused on particular places, he always talked about many other places at the same time. Third, I think that Martin's goal as a dissertation advisor was above all to get you to figure out your own approach. And so he was careful not to sort of steer you too much in one direction, or maybe in the direction that he might have gone in himself. And it's always been a bit of a puzzle to me because Martin, even though I was studying with him and I was studying Holocaust memory, he never really told me while I was his student about his own Holocaust experience. And I did figure it out. I did, come to know about it, but I felt that it wasn't something for me to broach while I was still his student, even though, I would have been fascinated to talk to him about it. And we only really started talking openly about it first virtually after the attack on the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, when he shared some of his thoughts, partly because that synagogue had been targeted because of its support for HIAS. And then at ISA in Toronto in 2017, which is the last time I saw him, where we had a really wonderful conversation about how he thought his childhood, what happened to him in the Holocaust, had impacted his children and grandchildren, which really got me thinking. And we talked about, how the relationship between individual generational memory and collective memory and public memory. So, I wish I could have had more conversations like this with him. And he was obviously hugely influential on my dissertation and the book that came out of it, and has been ever since. But I do wonder why he didn't want to talk about it. Maybe it was too difficult, but the more I thought about it in the last few weeks, I think that Martin maybe didn't, wanted me to be able to think through these things without being too reined in by what he had experienced. So I don't know, maybe that's something that Barbara can say something about. But the final thing that I'll say is that Martin, as much as he, was concerned about obviously doing rigorous scholarship, I would say that the number one priority for him, for his students, was always their well-being. So the first thing he always asked me about was, how are my kids? How's my husband? How's my mom? Right? How are you doing? How's life? And I think that this is such an important thing to signal, especially today when academia can be so cutthroat. And, he never, I think he also signaled that it's okay not to have a straightforward tenure track path and have a bit more of a winding path. So I'm so grateful that Martin was my advisor, and I'm really going to miss him.
Okay, Jenny, that was a very moving commentary and a great tribute to Martin. I just want to take a moment to introduce the last speaker on the panel, who is Barbara Heisler. And Barbara, I'm going to put you up on the screen in just a moment, but Barbara and I go back, I think, to 1978 or 1979. In 1979, we were in a program at Duke University. I was a doctoral student. She was a postdoctoral fellow who just arrived from the University of Chicago, where she had finished her PhD. And I'd forgotten that Dimitri might have been in the middle of all this, because, of course, Dimitri was there as well as a postdoc, and we were all being taught and mentored by Alejandro Portes. Many of you know Portes, and Charlie Hirschman and others who were in that program. And I met Barbara at that time, and we became fast, lifelong friends and colleagues. It's been my great pleasure to work with her for many years, and I count her as a very close friend. So why don't we now invite Barbara to join the discussion and reflect a little bit about what we've been saying about Martin and about her own work and how it figures in. Barbara, can you join?
Well, I don't know quite how to do it. Can you see me? Do I push on something?
No, you're fine. Daniel, I don't know how to put her on the screen. She doesn't seem, let's see, let me take myself off. There we go.
Yeah, but I don't see how to make her big either. Like, it's really strange.
Yeah. Okay, Barbara, just keep, you're fine. We can see you. We're all on the screen together here. So.
Okay, because I can't see anybody. So
yeah, if you go down to the webcams and click on the little boxes in the left-hand corner, it should, everyone should come up, you know.
Yeah, okay, let me try.
Yeah, it's a little boxes down there in the corner.
Oh,
and
webcams, yeah. Well, it's not doing anything.
Yeah, no. We're still, obviously still a technical issue, but we can see you and hear you just fine. So
okay,
please go ahead and give us your thoughts.
Strange to look at a screen and not see anybody. But anyway, I'll try to do my best here. Let's see. I hope you can hear me. I want to thank everybody, and especially Jim, for having the idea of having this panel today. I really appreciate that. It's been just about 2 months since Martin died, and it's been an incredibly difficult time for me, as you can probably imagine. So I really appreciate all the wonderful things that people said about him and about me in context. I just wanted to perhaps address a few things that people said about him today, and then maybe say a couple of things about our relationship. Or maybe perhaps I'll start with the relationship first, which really goes back to the time that Jim and I met at Duke University when I was a postdoctoral fellow there and he was a student. And this also involved Papa Dimitrios, who was also mentioned several times. I first met Martin in 1980, actually at an ISA meeting in Los Angeles. And this is where Dimitri introduced us for the first time. However, we just shook hands and said, nice to meet you, goodbye. And I didn't hear from him again till 1983, when I was teaching at Cleveland State University, and I received a phone call from him saying that he had gotten my telephone number and my place of work from another early scholar in migration, Aristide Solberg. And Aristide was a really old friend of mine going way back in Chicago from the 1960s. I'm sorry, I'm sort of getting a little overwhelmed with all of this.
Take your time.
Yeah, he called. I got a phone call from Martin. I really did not remember him actually from the first time we met him. That saying that he had received a grant from the State Department that he could investigate migration in Europe, and he wanted to pick my brains because I had published some things on the topic, and that was also the topic of my dissertation at the time. So we agreed to meet at the Europeanist meetings in 1983, which were taking place in Washington, D.C., and I so happened to be chairing a panel together with Aristide Solberg on international migration. I don't even remember the topic of the panel, Martin was in the audience, and afterwards we agreed to have lunch together. And unfortunately, the lunch that also involved Ari and also Zig Leighton Henry, who was also on this panel at the time, and some other people like Ira Katz-Nelson, who's an old friend of mine from Chicago. And we all had lunch together. And afterwards, Martin and I had coffee. And the coffee turned out to be a very long and extended discussion. And we ended up having dinner together. And I went back to Cleveland, and a few months later, maybe it was just a few days later, he called me and he said he was interested in maybe hearing the Cleveland Orchestra. He wanted to come to Cleveland, so that was the beginning of our relationship, really, and we were married in 1984. And on our honeymoon, we did the research, which was financed by the State Department. We went to Europe and mostly to England and France and Germany, I believe, at the time. So I just wanted to briefly also say that, it was Dimitri who had introduced us at the ISA meeting then in Los Angeles in 1980. And I think the story that Elspeth even mentioned also. Several things. I mean, I think Martin and I now have been married for 36 years, which is a pretty long time. And we had a very complex relationship, which included, of course, our mutual interests in various intellectual topics, not only international migration. And it's been very, as I said, it's been very difficult since he died. I did not expect it. He was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma, the beginning, just about this time last year. And we all expected for him to live a few more years, but that was not going to be the case, as the cancer eventually went to his brain, and there wasn't much that could be done about it. A couple of things that were mentioned by various speakers, just simply Martin liked to be, some people refer to him as Marty. And of course, this goes back to his time as a refugee to the United States when he wanted to become American. And Marty was kind of a name that seemed more appropriate for a young American boy than Martin, which was not a very popular name in the United States at the time. So I always called him Martin. I mean, the Marty time was really before my time. And one of the things that I think Didier mentioned and some other people had mentioned in his memorial that was organized by his daughter at a synagogue in Madison, Wisconsin, that Martin was always recommending books to people and talking about various subjects. I think it's also a topic that Jenny mentioned, that he read incredibly broadly. I mean, I was always incredibly impressed because I myself am a much more narrow reader. He read in different languages and on many, many different topics. And this is also what he tried to integrate into his work, which was, again, very complex, very broad, very, very historical, very comparative. I mean, he put all of these kinds of things together. And in that way, I think he was quite unique among people I have known. And something that has always impressed me very deeply. but it is also something that sometimes prevented him from finishing his various projects, because he always had many different projects going at the same time, and which made it sometimes difficult for him to concentrate just on one problem or one issue by itself. I know also that Martin cared very deeply about his students, which is a topic that Jenny mentioned, and not just Jenny. I mean, I heard from many of his former students, including even undergraduates, and of course graduate students who have written to me or have written cards on emails about how much, how much he influenced their intellectual life. The other issue that Didier mentioned, namely the idea of institution building, which was also very important to him. He was very much interested in promoting new ways of thinking, new ways of creating different segments in already existing institutions, such as his creation of ENMISA. And of course, as Jim mentioned, political scientists were generally relatively late in coming to this whole understanding of the importance of international migration. Of course, as a sociologist, I was a little bit ahead of the time, I believe, even with my dissertation. I remember that at the time, hardly anyone was really interested in the topic of international migration. Okay. Well, I think that's, I don't know, what else to say about this. Perhaps people could come back and address some of these things again. I'm not quite myself these days. So I hope people can understand that I'm, still reeling a bit from finding myself by myself and without him, and especially because our relationship was so complex. It didn't just involve the normal sort of husband-wife relationship, but also my intellectual companionship, which I, in a way, miss very much, as much probably as many other people, maybe probably much more, because we had a lot of time after we both retired. We spent a lot of time together, and we were able to discuss all kinds of topics. And all of this, of course, is no longer here. So I really appreciate what everybody has been saying. I think Martin would very much appreciate it as well. And well, I'll hand it back to Jim.
Okay, well, I think we can now open the floor for any questions or discussions. And if I could actually deputize Daniel maybe to monitor the screen. I still have not mastered this system very well. I don't know if people are putting questions in the Q&A section. I haven't seen any, but some things in the chat.
In the chat.
Daniel,
in the chat. There are some questions, and there's one, for example, by Catherine Götzi, who is in Tasmania, and unfortunately she says, I mean, it would be great to unmute her, but she says she's in a sleeping house and can't speak. So she's asking, maybe probably Barbara is the best person to answer that question, that Martin was talking about writing a sort of memoir, one of his many projects. Was he able to do so? And just one announcement. So for so Stephen Dietz, who was a former PhD student too, and Matthias and Willem and Heather Johnson and Michael Sharpie, who are on the in the audience, we can promote you also to moderator status, and you can speak with the video if you want that. So just let me know in the chat. So Willem, yes, but so maybe first, Barbara, the question that you that Catherine asked
about the memoir. Yes, Martin was in the last few years of his life had been working on a memoir, not really a memoir, it was really a broader perspective on his family and its location within the Jewish experience in Hungary. So it was a broad historical outline. He had been doing a lot of genealogical research in archives and various archives, and he had been working on a book-length manuscript about that. Unfortunately, I have been searching his computer for chapters of this memoir. He's been talking about it to me all the time, but he never really showed me anything written. Because I think in a way he just really was still percolating many of the ideas. And also it was kind of a painful subject for him, as you know, Jenny sort of suggested, digesting his own experience and trying to put it in a larger historical perspective, which is one of the things that he did. And unfortunately, as I said, I have not been able to find anything on his computer looked like a written chapter. I found a lot of notes. One of the characteristics of Martin, and again, which is because he was so broad in his thinking, he took copious notes on everything, on his ideas, on things he read. And among the many things that I found when I tried to look through his study, which I never looked in, generally speaking, because it was always not the most organized place in the world. And again, that was part of it because he was always working on so many different projects. So he had a lot of yellow pads, a lot of pads of ideas, and there must be about 50 or 60 yellow pads just full of ideas. And so far I haven't been able to really digest those, really look at them. I plan to do that sometime in the future, and I'm trying to do a more thorough search of his computer, but there's no obvious file indicating that he had actually written much, such a thing as a chapter. I'm not entirely sure. I know he talked about the first introductory chapter being something that he entitled "Why I Was Never Hungarian." And this was the idea of, you know, his identity. He's born in Hungary, but he never really identified as Hungarian because the Hungarians really did not want him. I mean, generally, he had to leave. And was he ever really American? I don't really think so. In many ways, Martin was really a citizen of the world, someone who didn't really have roots. And he often talked about the fact that he did not have roots, which is actually something that we had in common and we talked about, although I do have roots. I mean, I was born in Germany and I had a very, well, I wouldn't say conventional childhood because my parents were artists, so kind of an unconventional childhood. But I never considered myself to have roots either. For some reason, I just never identified as being from Germany, but it didn't really mean a lot to me. I've always felt I could be comfortable almost anywhere. And as some people know, I lived in Latin America and some other places as well. So, yeah, I think I guess that sort of answers the question about his memoir. I hope that I will find some more things. Maybe I can try to put it together somehow, but I really have not been able to do that at this point because I need some time to digest a few things.
Barbara, I'm just curious, how many languages does Martin speak?
Well, that's a good question. Now, obviously, he spoke French because when he first came from Hungary. He spent some time as a in a boarding school in Paris, and he of course loved France, and he loved going back there. His German was more reading rather than speaking. I think he spoke Spanish, but I think that's, I mean, he understood, Danish, of course, I've almost forgot.
Danish, yeah.
Mostly, I think his major languages were probably French and Danish. The others he could sort of understand and read, like German, he could certainly read much of it, and Dutch.
Well, I see that speaking of Dutch, we have Willem Moss with us and Stephen Dietz now. Willem, do you want to speak first?
Sure. Thanks very much. I want to share the condolence and also share an anecdote or a quick story that illustrates what I see as Martin's Menschlichkeit. So when I had just started as an assistant professor, one of my advisors reported on something, that a conversation he had had. So I sent an email, which I'm going to read and then talk to you about how Martin responded. Dear Professor Heisler, Roger Smith, one of my advisors from Yale, mentioned to me that you were having a discussion about the origins of European integration, in which you said that it all came down to security and that the economic rationales were added to sway public opinion, which was firmly non-militarist. In the attached article and my forthcoming book, I argue something slightly different, though I come at it from a different angle. Free movement rights for workers were introduced for economic reasons, but also as part of an effort to foster supranational political community. If you have time, I'd be interested in your reaction to my piece. Thanks very much. So he responded right away, Martin, and said, sorry, I won't have time to look at this for about 2 weeks. But in the meantime, if you're interested, here's some things to read. 2 weeks later, there came I just counted again, 2,300 word missive where he starts very nicely. I've now had a chance to read your article. It's very thought-provoking. Very well, imaginatively researched and original. Thanks very much for sending it. And then he proceeds to dissect and give very useful comments. Extremely, even though, I mean, I'd never met him at this point. I just sent him an email. So 2,300 words. And then he ends, I bet this is much more than you bargained for. The blame is yours in small part. I'd not thought about these issues and your topic for several years. Feel free to ignore all of this and do not feel compelled to respond. So this just illustrates to me, and then of course later, I started actually meeting him at conferences, and I share Didier's idea that Martin was one of the reasons to go to a conference. So that's it. Thanks and condolences.
Stephen?
Yes, thank you. I will also add my condolences. And yeah, because certainly, yes, I love seeing Martin at conferences. Particularly ISA was where I regularly ran into him. And I was thinking back because I TA'd for him comparative politics, and I always remember what a kind of fascinating, charismatic lecturer he was. Even though I was a grad student, I mean, I still learned something, in every class. And, then I took a seminar with him on nationalism and identity. And I think pretty much everything I work on now, a lot of those things, really came up in that seminar. A lot of the books that I still rely on, I first read there. And so, yes, as others have noted, kind of the incredible importance he had in the intellectual development of so many. And sorry, and I think as part of this, I mean, really thinking about how, he read incredibly broadly, and yeah, you never left a conversation without recommendations. But I think the ways in which he also saw identity playing out in so many different areas. And so, I remember, not only the conversations about, nationalism, but how it's institutionalized and consociationalism. I'm thinking back to his work on Belgium in particular, but also his real interest in IR theory and the way that identity plays out in IR theory. The last thing I would mention that, when I think of him, there's always also, this real like playfulness in conversations with him. And he knew that I'd studied Hungarian as part of my master's program. And so he was always like testing me to see like whether or not, I'd actually learned anything. But so often I remember these conversations where I would say something and, he would either have like a sly smile of like, do you really think that? But it was always done in like such a nice way. And the ways in which, you talked about a reception and there was like some idea that like really struck him. And he always had like this real like twinkle in his eye when he got excited about something. And so thinking about those memories of him as well. So yes, he will be deeply missed.
What a great remembrance. Daniel, do we have other questions? Have you seen anything else in the chat box? Things we need to address?
So we have, so as I mentioned, Catherine Getzi is online, but she said she can't speak, so she put a few comments in there. And I or somebody who has a better reading voice could take the trouble of just adding them in to the audio of this. Like several, I can do it. So I'm quoting, she's saying, his compassion, empathy, his constant thinking about trauma of migration, extremely humbling and inspiring. I'm currently working on a paper on cruelty and family separations at the US-Mexican border. His interest was inspired by a comment he had made on this some time ago, and I was often thinking that I would love to be able to discuss it with him. So understandable, and she had another comment a little earlier where she said, she mentioned the IPS section that he co-founded, that I briefly mentioned earlier too. And I'm quoting again, we really connected and spent a freezing afternoon talking at ISA San Francisco a couple of years ago about being cosmopolitans, polyglots, and our shared history, me being German and his history, his story that you probably all know. We reconnected in Toronto 2 years ago, and we spent another long afternoon continuing our discussions from San Francisco. So, and we have another, Cecilia Lynch at UC Irvine said we had thought about her of a potential speaker, but she couldn't, and she had to drop out to do some work. She left a comment half an hour ago saying that, I quote, I knew of Martin's work for many years and met him about 10 years ago. We talked about our individual work on religion, and his knowledge and warmth were amazing. I recently learned that he also worked in the Nordic region, and would have loved to discuss this with him as well. Finally, I agreed to chair a book prize committee last year with incredible dedication, despite being in and out of the hospital. My condolences to Barbara and all. Unfortunately, I have to grade student exams, so I must go.
Thank you.
I don't see questions. I see there's like Michael Sharpie and Anna Batter and Matthias Albert are in the audience. I don't know if you have further questions, or Anna Batter, who in 2013 got the Heisler Award for the best graduate paper. Congratulations.
Well, would anyone else like to respond to things that have been said? I know Didier and Elspeth have been quiet for a while. Didier, do you want to add anything? Or Jenny? Didier? You need to unmute yourself, Didier. That's where I go. There, I did it. No?
No, that he needs on the top left on his own. On the top left.
There we go. Now we can hear you, Didier. There we go.
I think it's really, if we go to more personal things, I think it was also the sense of joy and long discussions. And I have some pictures of these long discussions we had in Los Angeles, in San Diego, in Chicago, and I will send them a little bit later. And I think it's always the brightness, so the capacity of organizing a very intellectual discussion in any place. And it was also one of his main characteristics that all the discussion were becoming, from anecdote, were becoming real story, real narrative, which were saying many things about life. And I think it's really what I have in mind when I think about him. You begin with a couple of wine, of glass of wines, and it will be the story of Burgundy. It will be the economic relation.
You're again on mute. Sorry, Elspeth, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Elspeth, can you unmute yourself? Elspeth, and Didier, no?
I can't see them. I can't hear them.
Yeah, we're there. I'm sorry, Barbara. They are on mute.
Yeah, I see her, but I don't.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. So, Daniel, we have no way of unmuting her on this end, right?
Not that I know. And I'm trying to signal with my video.
I see. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. I was going to say that it was the anecdote, Barbara, of our dinner in San Diego at the ISA conference, where we went to the Tex-Mex restaurant all together and drank margaritas that were the size of small bathtubs, while the music, the mariachi band, was playing Luis Mariano, who, of course, Didier kept on saying, but he's French. He has nothing to do with Mexico. He's a complete imposter. And Didier's comment that he was an imposter kicked off a conversation about identity, entitlement to culture and place, which went on late into the evening and a couple of margaritas further, and really stuck in my mind as something that I would take away with me about enacting citizenship, enacting entitlement, and what does that mean in which kinds of contexts. So once again, a brilliant example of great scholarship, but also tremendous friendship. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elspeth.
Yeah, and Jenny, would you like to weigh in before we go back to Barbara for a few final words? Huh?
No, I mean, it's just wonderful to watch what everybody has to say, because, you know, I think we all have the same person in front of us, clearly. Even though it sounds funny to say, but, you know, you never know whether you know somebody in the same way that everybody else does. And it's just wonderful to see. I especially liked Steve's, you know, when he said Martin always had a twinkle in his eye.
Oh.
Jenny, you've muted yourself. There we go.
Nope.
No, still
mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
The software seems a little bit iffy. The twinkle in his eye, I think that so well describes Martin. And, you know, he clearly had so much fun when he was talking to you, and it wasn't just a job to advise people. And it's so nice to see also that mentorship for him obviously didn't stop with his students. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, again, a very, very fond remembrance. Stephen, would you like to add anything finally?
No, I mean, I think, you know, but again, I mean, I'm just thinking about, you know, how he, you know, has impacted so many people in terms of, you know, the work that we do, and I think particularly for his grad students, I mean, the way that we also teach our students and interact with our students. is one of his legacies.
I think we're all thinking about the twinkle in the eye here and the intellectual spark that Marty brought to everything. And I think as a tribute to him and to Barbara, I mentioned earlier, I think they are the ultimate academic power couple. Maybe we can go back to Barbara for some final thoughts, Barbara, before we close the session.
Yes, I just wanted to repeat that I really appreciate this whole session. It's kind of unusual for me since I retired. I really have not been very active in professional organizations. I have been writing. I've actually managed to write a couple of books and several articles while retired. And much of it was inspired by Martin. But we didn't really talk so much about our mutual work. I was pretty secretive about my own work often, especially since most recently it's been on a very different subject, namely Airbnb and the future of housing. I have had a long interest in issues of housing, and I had written articles about that and done research on foreclosures and homelessness and issues like that before. It's another part of my intellectual interest that Martin didn't particularly share. I'm not so sure he was so enthused about my work on Airbnb, but I did it together with my old friend Lily Hoffman, whom I actually knew long before Martin. So we got together on this particular subject, which actually is a very important one, and I myself hope to pursue this further in terms of the housing issue, housing and housing inequality, which is another issue that's very dear to my heart. So anyway, I am incredibly thankful, and I was also moved by many of the comments, which really give so much tribute to Martin, who was really an extraordinary person, that a person who had, I often think about him in terms of his childhood and the horrible things that he went through as a child, and how he came out so well on the other side, despite having some scars on that. And I think some of these scars sort of came to haunt him in later life, as is often the case. I think for many years, he, tried to pursue his professional career and tried to put some of these memories of his childhood and his family and the Holocaust experience sort of in the background of his mind. But in his later years, especially since we were retired, these had really come back to him, and they had become an important part of his thinking. And this is why he was working on the memoir. And unfortunately, as I said, I'm not sure what happened to that memoir. And it's one of my projects in the near future, to try to find out what I can find out, what he left behind on that, and put together the pieces if I can. I may not be able to, but I hope to do that. And I hope to maybe also work with his daughter Laura on that a little bit, because he also talked with her at length about that. And I think Jenny had mentioned that he became very interested in how the experience of Holocaust or trauma in general. And one of the things he actually wanted to work on was the notion of trauma. What constitutes trauma, and how is it passed on over generations, as there is some increasing research that shows that the trauma experienced by individuals is actually passed on to their children and maybe even to their grandchildren. And so this is, I hope that, I can put some of these pieces together, because this was something that was very important to him, and especially in his later years. So, I think that's basically.
Okay, that is such a moving way in which sort of end the panel. And I want to thank everyone, especially Didier and Elspeth and Jenny, for joining us. Stephen and Willem jumping on, Daniel. And I want, on behalf of all of us who are Martin's colleagues on the ISA, the ENMISA, we want to thank Barbara and the family, the Heisler family, for giving us such a great person in Martin Heisler. We will always remember his accomplishments and his contribution to the field. And we have some awards that bear his name. So his name will go on for many years into posterity here, and we will always look back on him as someone who is an inspiration. Unless anyone has a final thought, Daniel, do you see anything else that in the chat box that we've overlooked? If not, then let's all wish Barbara. Barbara, it's still a little early for you out there on the West Coast, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's another reason I'm not quite there. So I'm there, but I'm not so sure I'm all that coherent at the moment.
Oh, you were quite coherent, and we will start, I guess, move on with what's left of the day for each of us. And thank you all for joining us. And Barbara, we will be in touch. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and goodbye for now.
Yes, goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Best wishes.
Yeah.
Bye.
Merci.
Wiedersehen.
Merci à tous.
Bye-bye.
Danke. Gracias.